Decoding Finnish History, and my name is Jukka Uusitalo. Today, I am going to read you a chapter from the book titled The Archer and the Steppe, or the Empires of Scythia, a history of Russia and Tartary from year 1860, by the author F.K. GRAHAME. Neither history nor tradition has left us any positive information when the first colonists from Asia entered Europe. But it is generally considered that the Finns were the first inhabitants of Russia, and indeed of the whole continent, and that they were from thence driven gradually northwards to the extremities of Norway, Finland, and Lapland, where they now dwell by the second immigration, Budini, who were probably Finns, he describes as being among the oldest possessors of the soil, and inhabiting that part of Russia which is now called Podolia. A Greek colony had established itself in their province, who tilled the ground and supplied Greece with corn, and they affirmed that the Budini practiced magic, and were in the habit once a year of changing themselves into wolves, when they prowled about in this shape for a few days, and then resumed their human form. The same charge of sorcery was constantly brought against the Finns in the Middle Ages. The tale of the werewolf, probably derived from them, is familiar to all, and even now they have many professed magicians. The Isidones, who appear to have been the same with the Igors, Herodotus informs Nos, were a civilized nation, dwelling to the far east. Beyond them, to the north, the country was impassable owing to the white feathers that were continually falling, and to their right was the land of the Griffins, who guarded the country of gold. Among the Scythians themselves, who were divided into many kingdoms or tribes, the same Greek writer particularly remarks upon the Melankleni, who always clothed in black, the Agathyrsi, whose province abounded in gold, and who painted themselves, their manners being peculiar for their effeminacy, and the Argipai, whose name was derived from the wild white horses abounding in their district, which was situated on the Volga and Don. And he observes of the whole people that the Scythians have not only a great abhorrence of all foreign customs, but each province seems unalterably tenacious of its own. Anacharsis, the celebrated philosopher, and the brother of their king having visited Greece, wished, upon his return to his native land, to introduce some of her customs among his countrymen. But incurring their displeasure by this endeavor, he lost his life by the barbarous chief's own hand, and Sides, a Scythian prince, having been educated by his mother, who was a Greek, experienced soon after his accession a similar fate for a like offense. About this period there were several wise and learned Scythians, whose names were respected even among the Greeks, and of whom Anacharsis, who was a contemporary of Solon and Decimus, appeared to have been the chief. And one of the most beautiful of Lucian's works derives its title from the Scythian physician Toxaris. The Scythians adored several divinities, of whom Mars was the chief, and the only god to whom they offered sacrifices and oblations. And with many of the wilder tribes, he was their sole deity, and was generally represented among them under the semblance of a naked sword. Chapter 6. The Finns, or Chudes, that is, barbarians, or nations alien to the Slavonic race, as they are called in Russia, formerly occupied all that part of the country which lies to the north of the Valdai Hills, between the Vistula and Ural Mountains, and are commonly considered to have been the aboriginal inhabitants of Scandinavia, from whence they were expelled by the Goths. The Budini, described by Herodotus, appear to have been a Finnish tribe, and Ptolemy in the 2nd century mentions the Finni, together with the Githones and Venidae, as nations of small extent and power in the neighborhood of the Vistula. while in the time of Pliny, the southern coast of the Baltic, to the eastward of that river, was vaguely termed Finningia. Pritchard and Latham are of opinion that the Finlanders, Laplanders, and most of the Siberian tribes belong to the same race, which appears to have borne a close affinity to the Huns and Igors, with whom they are by some writers identified, and collectively termed Ugrian. As the Slavonians became more powerful, they gradually reduced all the aboriginal hordes and drove them further northward. For as we learn from Nestor, the ancient chronicler of Russia, the Finns in his time occupied all the territory from Lake Peipus eastward, and traces of them are to be met with at the present day, in more or less interspersed with the Slavonians, over all the northern part of Russia, particularly in the hilly district of Valdai and in the government of St. Petersburg, besides several tribes on the Volga, and the inhabitants of the province of Finland, by whom it is called Suomenmaa, or the country of lakes. The Magyars of Hungary also belong to the same race, which is remarkable for its love of music and poetry, and possesses many songs and heroic ballads, with long romances and legends in verse. They worship the sun, moon, and stars, amongst which the constellation of the Great Bear received particular honors, besides the winds, lakes, rivers, fountains, and cataracts, and several goddesses. Their principal deity was called Jomala, and they believed in a future state. They were early acquainted with the art of smelting iron. Finnish swords are renowned in the Icelandic sagas, and tradition ascribes to Finns the discovery of various mines in Sweden. They were also particularly attached to agriculture, and appear to have been well versed in all the implements of husbandry, though, from the rigor of the climate, they were principally dependent for their subsistence upon the produce of their numerous lakes. The province of Finland was partly subject to Russia in the early period of her history, but in the 12th century it was conquered by Sweden, who long endeavored by force and tyranny to convert the natives to Christianity. An English priest called Henry, who had accompanied Erik, the Swedish general, in this expedition, was appointed bishop of the country, and zealously commenced the propagation of the Christian faith. But the violent measures which he used to compel the Finns to renounce their idols produced an insurrection against the invaders, and Henry, falling a victim to the animosity of the inhabitants, was assassinated in a tumult, and being afterwards canonized, has since been made the patron saint of Finland. Both before and after his death, great cruelties were inflicted upon the unfortunate people, all who refused baptism being mercilessly put to death by fire and sword. And though they were ultimately compelled by persecution to profess the Christian faith, they still remain very superstitious. In the Middle Ages, the word Finn was synonymous with that of sorcerer, and it was generally believed that this people had a particular intercourse with the devil. And at all times, they have been celebrated for their conjurers, who act precisely in the same manner as the Angehocks in Greenland, and the shamans among the northern Tartars of Siberia. Abo, the capital of Finland till 1827, when its destruction by fire caused the seat of government to be removed to the modern port of Helsingfors, a well-built city guarded by the strong fortress of Sveaborg, was founded about the 12th century, and during the Middle Ages suffered severely 5 times from fire, besides in 1509 being sacked and almost totally destroyed by the Danes. It is built upon a promontory between the gulfs of Bothnia and Finland, and before they were transferred to its rival, contained a university, museum, and library, besides several other public edifices. The greater part of Finland remained in the possession of Sweden till 1809, when she was finally subdued by Russia, and her loss was a serious blow to the former power, to whom she had always proved a valuable ally. Her soldiers distinguished themselves under the banners of Gustavus Adolphus in the 30 Years' War. In the days of Tacitus, she was celebrated for her archers, and a Finnish regiment fought valiantly in the army of William III at the Boyne. The name of Russians is first mentioned in history in the year 839, when a few who had visited Constantinople with their sovereign, whom the Byzantine chronicles call Shakanus, which was probably his title Chagan or Khan, accompanied the embassy sent by Theophilus, Emperor of the East, to Louis le Debonair, King of France, the son and successor of Charlemagne, in the train and under the protection of the pompous ambassador of the Greeks. Some historians suppose them to have been the descendants of the Roxolani, who invaded Moesia AD 70 and defeated 2 Roman cohorts when Adrian made peace with their king, but who were subsequently driven to the north, where the geographer of Ravenna, AD 886, places them in the vicinity of Novgorod, the Russians having founded a kingdom there before that period, and consider them to have been a Slavonic or Sarmatic tribe. But the Russians are mentioned by Constantine Porphyrogenitus as being a distinct people from the Slavonians, and in his time speaking a different language. According to Levesque, they are descended from the Huns, but assumed the name and language of their Slavonic conquerors, who were undoubtedly the descendants of the Sarmatians, and the traditions of Sweden maintain that the Huns anciently formed a powerful monarchy in Russia, which they relate was then very densely peopled, far more so than at the present day. It is certain that after the death of Attila, when his followers were driven back upon the plains of Scythia, the Slavonians were also expelled by the Goths from the shores of the Danube, having been forced by the Huns to the extreme north and southwest of Russia, and spreading over Sarmatia, or western Scythia, they were scattered and divided into many tribes and nations, the principal of whom were the Poles, under their chief Lech, from whose name they were anciently called Leki, the Drevlians, who derived their appellation from the woods and forests among which they dwelt in Volhynia, and the Krivichis, who founded the city and fortress of Smolensko. According to some authors, the Russians were so designated from Rossaya, which in their language signifies a dispersion, or scattered people. Others, among whom are Herberstein, and the Tartar historian Abulghasi Bayadur, Prince of Charizme, state from Russis, a brother of the Polish hero Lech, while it is also asserted that they received their name from the color of their hair. And according to Levesque, the common Oriental traditions affirm that they were at all times a distinct people, having a different origin from any other, and that from time immemorial, their habits, manners, and language bore no affinity to those of any race in Europe. Towards the early part of the 5th century, that portion of the Russian territory that was peopled by the Slavonians became divided into several separate states, of which the largest and most important were Novgorod, Smolensko, Polotsk, and Kiev. The traditions of the latter city relate that in the middle of the 3rd century, 3 Sarmatian or Slavonian brothers, Kivi, Skyeko, and Koranus, came from the east with their sister Libeda, and divided all the south of Russia among them, giving their names to their own states. Kivi founded the city of Kiev, and heading an inroad of the Sarmatians upon the Eastern Empire, penetrated with his followers as far as Constantinople, and forced the Emperor Probus to cede a large treasure to the barbarians and propose terms of peace, but subsequently, leading another expedition into Bulgaria, he was killed in battle, and his kingdom, with those of his brothers, destroyed in the following century by the overwhelming and terrific invasion of the Huns. Some idea may be formed of what this invasion, of which we have comparatively so slight record, must have been, by the accounts which have descended to us of the more recent conquests of the Mongols, and how every vestige of civilization, had there been any to destroy, must have been annihilated and utterly swept away in their terrific and destructive course. They appear to have spread even as far as the marshy shores of the north. But about 50 years later, upon their descent into Hungary, and abandonment of the wasted steppes of Scythia, the Sarmatians or Slavonians wandered back to their old haunts, and a successor of Kiev, of the same name, rebuilt the city of Kiev, A.D. 430. It was subsequently conquered by Oleg, a warlike and victorious prince of Novgorod, in whose possession it remained till his death, after which the Chazars subdued the city and state, and ruled nearly all the south of Russia for more than 200 years. According to Nestor, the old historian and venerable Bade of Russia, Novgorod was founded about the same time by the Slavonians as the second erection of Kiev. Advantageously situated near the confluence of the Volklayov with Lake Ilmen, and possessing by Lake Ladoga and the Neva a direct communication with the Baltic Sea, some writers have supposed that a large Finnish city existed on its present site, which idea appears rather to be supported by its name Novogordo, or New City, previous to the eruption of the Slavonians upon the north of Russia, and some ancient ruins, which till lately were to be seen in the neighborhood of Novgorod, are considered to have been the remains of this old and unchronicled capital of the Finns, or what possibly may have been a city of the Huns. The government was republican, under a chief magistrate chosen from among the boyards, and it early attained so much power and opulence from the extensive trade carried on by its merchants and nobles by means of caravans among the Permians, Chazars, and Bulgarians of the Volga, and through them with Persia and India, that who can resist the gods and the great Novgorod was a common proverb among the surrounding nations, and 400,000 inhabitants are said to have resided within its walls. But her territories were encircled by enemies, the adjoining Finnish or Chudish tribes, and the Permians, continually invading the Commonwealth, and the treasure which their temples were reputed to contain excited the avarice of the Scandinavian sea kings, or Varangian corsairs as they are called in the Russian chronicles, who frequently devastated their coasts, and, possessing themselves of the provinces of Revel and Livonia, carried on for many years a perpetual war with the neighboring Slavonic and Finnish nations. These pirates hired themselves as mercenary soldiers to the highest bidder, and their assistance was often purchased by, as the Novgorodians, against the plundering incursions of their other foes, who at length, strengthening themselves by union, so imperiled the existence of the Republic, whose power had been weakened by constant warfare, that Gostromisla, the last male descendant of a long line of princes, advised his fellow citizens on his deathbed to nominate his grandson Rurik, the prince of the Varangians, his successor chief magistrate of Novgorod, and thus secure the alliance and protection of the Varangians. Rurik, who was the son of the Swedish monarch Ludbrat, and his queen Umila, the daughter of Gostromisla, was born at Uppsal, A.D. 830, and in the year 861 responding to the invitation of the boyards of Novgorod, accompanied by his two brothers Truva and Sineus, and a motley crew of Finnish, Slavonic, and Norman adventurers, he sailed with a few ships up the Volkhov, and endeavored to establish himself in the city. His claim was disputed, however, by a large majority of the inhabitants, who objected to the rule of a foreigner and a Varangian, whose followers they considered as mere uncivilized depredators. And refusing them access into their town, they closed the gates against him. But instead of returning to his ships, he resorted to arms, and building the town of Ladoga as headquarters for his troops, he fortified it with a rampart of earth, his brothers also establishing themselves within a short distance of the city. The Novgorodians, assembling in large force, advanced from the town under their most able general Vadim, to expel the invaders from their entrenchments. But being defeated in a desperate engagement, their army completely destroyed, and their leader slain, Rurik, immediately quitting his stronghold, marched upon Novgorod, where the citizens, being without a general and totally disorganized by their defeat, submitted to him without further resistance, and placed their government in his hands, A.D. 862. He appointed Cineus to the sovereignty of Bielo-Ozero, and Truva to that of Izborsk, chief towns in tributary territories, which, on their both dying without heirs, he again incorporated with his own dominions. And abolishing the republican form of government, he took the title of Veliki Knets, or Grand Prince. He pacified and strengthened his dominions, and appears to have ruled with justice and moderation, reconciling the people to his government by adopting the Slavonic language and manners, his followers taking wives from among that nation, and he himself espousing a descendant of the ancient ruling family of Novgorod, in order to procure an additional claim to the throne. And, at his death in 878, he was succeeded by his son Igor, who, being only a year old, Oleg, the brother-in-law of Rurik, took upon himself the office of regent. The Varangians were not long content with this northern extremity of the Slavonic dominions, and the territory of Kiev, whose capital is situated, like Rome and Constantinople, upon 7 hills, with their summits overlooking the broad and rapid stream of the Dnieper, was too productive, thickly populated and fertile, to be long overlooked by such daring and rapacious freebooters, ever in search of adventure and plunder, and who, though accustomed to the frozen and tideless waters of the Baltic, and its marshy and inhospitable shores, have wherever the opportunity was afforded by the weakness, civil discords, or pusillanimity of those nations with whom they have come in contact, established themselves in the more favored and genial atmosphere of the South, and in England, France, and the most sunny and fertile provinces of Italy, have made their power respected, and their vengeance feared, erecting kingdoms and noble houses, whose descendants are now proud to trace their origin from the Rude, and warlike followers of the Varangian sea kings. Shortly after they had occupied Novgorod, they turned their arms towards the rich and grassy plains upon which Kiev stands, and under the command of Oskold, the stepson of Rurik, and Dir, one of his chiefs, drove out the Khazars, who many years before had extended their sway over this city and province, and having firmly established their power over the whole territory of Kiev, in 866 made the first warlike descent of the Russians upon Constantinople. Taking advantage of the temporary absence of the Emperor Michael from the city, they sailed with a naval armament of 200 vessels through the Bosphorus, and even occupied the port of Byzantium, returning to their own country laden with the spoils of the Grecian cities. Though a violent storm, according to the Greek legends, occasioned by the intercession of the Virgin Mary, a part of whose cloak was preserved by the Byzantines as a sacred relic, and carried out in procession, at the command of their emperor, on his hasty return, compelled them to evacuate prematurely the harbor and waters of Constantinople. About this time, a regular communication was established between the Grecian Empire and the coasts of the Baltic Sea by the commercial enterprise of the merchants of Novgorod and Kiev. A lake and river in summer, and the ice in winter, connecting the former city with the Baltic, she received in her stores all the produce of the north and transported it by canoes to Kiev, where it was accumulated in vast magazines till the annual departure of a fleet to Constantinople, which usually took place in June. The ships sailed down the Dnieper as far as the 13 cataracts, whose rocks and rapid falls break the smooth and even course of that river, some of which they were enabled to cross by simply lightening the cargo, but avoiding the more precipitate and formidable by dragging the vessels past them overland. And then, resting on an island below the last fall, they held a festival in celebration of their escape from the perils of the river and the attacks of the hostile tribes who roamed along its fur-lined shores, before proceeding to encounter the more formidable winds and breakers of the sea. But, preparatory to crossing the Euxine, the damages which their frail barks had sustained in their rough passage over land and water were repaired on a second island near the mouth of the river, and with a fair wind, a few favorable days would moor them in the harbor of Constantinople. The Russian canoes, which consisted of a single tree hollowed out, and this narrow foundation raised and extended on every side by planks, till it had attained the desired height and length, were laden with slaves of every age, the Russians being in great demand as soldiers at Constantinople. Hides, furs, amber from the Baltic shores, honey and beeswax, and they returned at stated seasons with a rich cargo of corn, oil, wine, the manufactures of Greece, the embroidery of Persia, and the spices and ebony of the Indian Isles. A company of Russian merchants settled at Constantinople and in the principal provincial cities and towns of the Greek Empire for trading purposes, and the treaties formed between the two nations protected their persons, effects, and privileges. But the marvelous accounts which the merchants and sailors who accompanied the fleets in these commercial enterprises carried home of the wealth and magnificence of Constantinople excited the desire of their countrymen for a larger supply than their comparatively scanty trade afforded, and, in the space of 190 years, 4 naval expeditions were undertaken by the Russians to plunder the treasures of the Greek capital. The Christian religion appears to have been first transported to Kiev in the expedition of Oskold, who with many of his followers, on his return from his hostile enterprise against Constantinople, embraced Christianity, and Constantine Porphyrogenitus and other Greek historians relate that during the lifetime of that prince, a bishop was sent by the Emperor Basil the Macedonian, and St. Ignatius, the Patriarch of Byzantium, to Kiev, who made many converts, chiefly in consequence of the miraculous preservation of a volume of the Gospels, which remained unconsumed when thrown into the midst of flames by the unbelievers. And the Metropolitan of Russia appears in the catalogue of prelates subject to the Byzantine patriarchs as early as the year 891. In the reign of Igor, a church of the prophet Elias is mentioned as existing at Kiev, where the Christian Varangians swore to the observance of the treaty formed by the Russian prince and his people, with the ambassadors of Constantinople, and the catacombs and caves of the Pechersky monastery at Kiev are supposed to have been excavated by them. In 879, the year following the death of Rurik Oleg, the regent of Novgorod, assembling a large army from among all the numerous tribes who peopled his dominions, and accompanied by the infant prince Igor, marched against Smolensko, the capital of the Kriviches, a Slavonic tribe, by whom it had been founded about the same time as Novgorod, having overrun and swept away all the smaller towns and villages that studded the plains between the two cities. He subjected Smolensko to his sway, and embarking his followers in a fleet of the small and precarious vessels used in the commerce of Novgorod, which he had compelled her merchants to supply, and caused to be transported with his army overland till he reached the shores of the Dnieper, a little to the north of Smolensko. He sailed down the river and arrived before Kiev. There, leaving his ships, he disguised himself as a Novgorod merchant, and entering the town, professed to have arrived with a fleet of trading vessels, paying a visit alone and on foot to the palace of the Grand Prince, whom he induced to accompany him, with merely a few courtiers and attendants, to inspect his fleet and goods. As soon as the deluded Oskold had arrived on the banks of the river, the Novgorodians, leaping from their barks, seized upon the unfortunate prince, whom they instantly murdered, and Oleg, forcing his way into the city at their head, took possession of the whole province, and removed the seat of his government to Kiev, its nearer proximity to Constantinople, and the superiority of its climate and soil, with its central position, giving it a great advantage over his own capital. He subdued or won over to his authority many of the Slavonic and Lithuanian tribes, whose allegiance had hitherto been exacted by the Chazars, and commanded the Severians and Raditniches, two Caucasian nations, to desist from paying their customary tribute to that people, and reconciled the Kiovians to his government by relaxing the severity of the laws and reducing the taxes. After reigning some years in Kiev, he resigned the government to Igor till his return, and fitting out an expedition for the invasion of Constantinople. In the year 904 he sailed to the entrance of the Bosphorus, where the Greeks, who were prepared to resist him, had raised a strong barrier of arms and fortifications to defend the passage. But avoiding this, he caused his ships to be dragged across the land, and arrived before Constantinople, where, hanging his shield as a trophy over the gates, he marched with his warriors into the capital. Completely taken by surprise, the Greeks, astonished and alarmed at the unexpected manner in which the savage chieftain had overcome the formidable obstruction they had erected to oppose him, fondly supposing that it would prove insurmountable to barbarians, with whom the art of engineering, as practiced by them, was unknown, proposed to negotiate with the invaders, and concluded an immediate truce. While the strangers remained in the city, the Emperor Leo gave a banquet to the Russian prince and his soldiers, at which he attempted to rid himself of his troublesome enemies through the cowardly medium of poison. But the attempt failing, the Byzantine monarch was obliged to accept an ignominious peace and ransom the city from destruction. The terms of the treaty bound Leo to pay a tribute to every vessel belonging to Oleg, and to remit all taxes and duties upon Russian merchants trading in the Greek Empire. The Grand Prince returned with his fleet adorned with silken sails to Kiev, and after a few years formed a new treaty with Constantinople for the security of the lives and fortunes of the Russian traders, in which it was agreed that the goods of a Russian dying without testament in the dominions of the Emperor of Constantinople should be transmitted to his heirs in Russia, and if bequeathed by will, should be forwarded to the legatees. That if a Russian killed a Greek, or a Greek a Russian, the assassin should be put to death on the spot where the crime was committed. Or if the murderer had effected his escape, his fortune was to be adjudged to the nearest heir of the murdered. a provision being made for the wife of the criminal. It was also provided that, for striking another with a sword or any other weapon, a fine of 3 liters of gold should be exacted from the offender, and that a thief, Greek or Russian, caught in the fact, might be put to death with impunity. But if he should be seized, the stolen goods were to be restored, and the criminal condemned to pay thrice their value. Although Oleg was only regent of the empire, yet he governed in his own person for 34 years, and Igor did not succeed to his father's throne till the death of his guardian, which took place in 913, from the effects of a serpent's bite, the reptile, according to the chronicles of Nestor, having crept into the skull of a favorite horse, which diviners had predicted 5 years before, would be the cause of its master's death. On hearing that the animal was dead, which since the fatal prophecy he had ceased to mount, Oleg visited the body, and placing his foot on the head, exclaimed, "So this is the dreaded animal," when the serpent suddenly darting out, inflicted upon his foot a mortal wound. Igor, who was at this time 38 years of age, spent the greater part of his reign in quelling the disturbances that arose in various parts of his dominions. He defeated and drove back the Pechenegans, a Tartar nation whose territory lay on the north of the Caspian Sea, and who advanced against Kiev in great force, and subdued the Drevlians, who peopled the modern province of Volhynia, and were the last of the Slavonic tribes to abandon their wandering mode of life, having then but recently settled down in towns and villages. After encountering an obstinate resistance of 3 years, he also reduced to submission the Ugliches, a nation whose territory lay on the shores of the Dnieper, and had asserted its independence, and passed the first 28 years of his reign in almost constant warfare. But having succeeded in restoring tranquility to his states, the Grand Prince was urgently importuned by his chiefs and soldiers to follow the example of his predecessor and endeavor to reimburse his country for the losses it had sustained in these civil wars by plundering the riches and treasures of the wealthy Grecian cities. This advice agreed too well with his own ambition and avarice to be rejected or disregarded, and in 941 he equipped a fleet for the invasion of Constantinople, with which he advanced into the Black Sea, while the naval powers of the empire were employed in a war with the Saracens, and after devastating the provinces of Pontus, Paphlagonia, and Bithynia, entered the Bosphorus. But the Greeks, who were now aware of the real strength and pertinacity of their northern adversary, prepared energetically to resist this sudden inroad, and fitting out every remaining vessel and galley that was not employed on foreign service, with an unusually abundant supply of the terrible fire that they always used in their warlike operations, and whose flames no water would allay, poured it from every side of their ships upon the enemy, sinking and destroying 2/3 of his canoes. Many thousands of Russians, to avoid being burned, sprang into the sea, where the greater number perished in the waves. Others, who were captured, were beheaded by order of the emperor, and the rest were inhumanly murdered by the Thracian peasants as they attempted to gain the shore. The remaining vessels escaping into shallow water, Igor returned with them to Kiev, where, recruiting his forces by alliance with the Pechenegans, his former foes, he prepared another expedition for the following spring, with which he hoped to retrieve his losses and accomplish his revenge. But the Greeks, anxious to avert the calamities of another Russian invasion, and not willing to encounter the chance of defeat from an infuriated and vindictive adversary, offered to revive the treaty that the Greek emperor had been forced by Oleg to accept, and pay to Igor the tribute which his more successful predecessor had exacted for each of his vessels, terms that, after some hesitation, were accepted by the Russian prince. In these naval hostilities, says Gibbon, every disadvantage was on the side of the Greeks. Their savage enemy afforded no mercy. His poverty promised no spoil. His impenetrable retreat deprived the conquerors of the hopes of revenge. And the pride or weakness of empire indulged an opinion that no honor could be gained or lost in the intercourse with barbarians. At first, their demands were high and inadmissible. 3 pounds of gold for each soldier or mariner of the fleet. The Russian youth adhered to the design of conquest, but the counsels of moderation were recommended by the hoary sages. Be content, they said, with the liberal offers of Caesar. Is it not far better to obtain without a combat the possession of gold, silver, silks, and all the objects of our desires? Are we sure of victory? Can we conclude a treaty with the sea? We do not tread on the land, we float on the abyss of water, and a common death hangs over our heads. The memory of these Arctic fleets that seemed to descend from the polar circle left a deep impression of terror on the imperial city. By the vulgar of every rank it was asserted and believed that an equestrian statue in the square of Taurus was secretly inscribed with a prophecy, how the Russians in the last days should become masters of Constantinople. 4 years after his return to Kiev, Igor set out on a journey among the Drevlians to enforce the payment of their tribute. He had already loaded them with heavy exactions, and provoked them at length to resistance by demanding double the ordinary amount. At a council they held among themselves, they decided no longer to submit to his tyranny and oppression. "This prince," said they, "is a mere wolf, who will steal the sheep one by one till he has destroyed the whole flock. He must be assassinated." They stationed an ambuscade in a wood, through which he and his retinue would probably pass, near a town called Korosten, on the river Uskya, and there waylaid and murdered him. His death took place in 945, in the 69th year of his age, and he was buried near the spot where he fell, a kurgam or tumulus, according to the ancient Scythian and Slavonian custom, being raised over his tomb. He married Olga, or Prekasna as she is called in the Russian chronicles, which signifies very beautiful, and by whom he had one son, Sviatos Laf. She was born in a village called Sibut, about 8 miles from Pleskov, and was originally the daughter of a ferryman, or as some historians relate, of a reduced boyard, and descended from the ancient Chagans of Russia. Igor met her first accidentally in a wood while hunting, and being struck with her great beauty, elevated her to share his throne. And in the year 903 their marriage was celebrated with great ceremony and feasting in the temple of Peron at Pleskov. On receiving the news of her husband's murder, she assumed the reins of government in Kiev, and resolving to avenge tenfold the assassination of the Grand Prince, an opportunity was not long in presenting itself, for shortly after her accession, Mael, or Malditus, the prince of the Drevlians, sent an embassy to her court to solicit her hand in marriage. She barbarously caused all the deputation to be buried alive, dispatching messengers of her own to their country, saying, if the inhabitants wished her to be their princess and mistress, they must send her a larger number of wooers. And then, ordering the new envoys to be scolded to death, immediately set out, accompanied by a large retinue, to the land of the Drevlians, before intelligence of the cruel fate of their countrymen could by any means have reached their province. Arrived there, she professed to comply with the proposals of the prince, whom she invited to a banquet with his principal nobles and chiefs. and in the midst of the repast, when they were nearly all intoxicated with wine, they were suddenly massacred by the armed Russian attendants of Olga, who had previously given her servants instructions to that effect. And her army pillaged and ravaged the country, reducing the town of Korostin, the scene of the murder of Igor, to ashes, and finally subjugating the province and annexing it to her own kingdom. On her return to Kiev, Olga devoted her energies and resources to the improvement of Russia and the promotion of the welfare and prosperity of its people. She made a tour round her dominions, and during her progress caused bridges to be built and roads to be constructed, encouraging commercial enterprise and attempting to increase and facilitate the internal communication of the country. She founded many towns and villages, and appears to have been deservedly loved by the nation, whom she governed with justice and moderation, and by whom she was long held in esteem and respect. In the year 955, during a period of profound peace in her dominions, she abdicated the throne, and accompanied by numerous attendants, sailed from Kiev to visit the Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus at Constantinople, where she was received by the Byzantine sovereign with the greatest magnificence, and the polished and learned Caesar himself appears to have been much impressed by the unusual intelligence and information possessed by his singular guest. The object of her journey appears to have been to obtain a more complete knowledge of the practice and doctrines of the Christian religion, whose votaries she had always protected. In Kiev, for shortly after her arrival in the Grecian capital, she embraced Christianity and was baptized by the Patriarch Polychiutes in the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Constantinople, her example being followed by her uncle, 34 ladies and 22 officers of her suite, 2 interpreters, and 34 Russian merchants, who composed her retinue, the emperor himself standing as her sponsor and presenting her with many valuable and splendid gifts. After her return to Kiev, she firmly persisted in her new religion and labored assiduously to propagate it in her dominions, traveling to her native village of Sibut and to Pleiskov for the purpose of instructing the inhabitants. But her exertions did not meet with much success, both her family and nation obstinately adhering to their ancient faith. She built several churches, and many Greek missionaries settled in the empire, no attempt being made by the people to destroy the Christian religion by persecution, it rather being treated with ridicule and contempt. But her example appears to have made some impression upon them, and many of the Russian traders from Constantinople, who had been struck with the magnificent churches of the Greeks, the splendor of their ceremonies, and the solemnity of their services, compared it on their return home with the idol worship and cruel religious rites of their own country, and in many instances professed the Christian faith. This was more especially the case in the city and province of Novgorod, where tradition asserts that even during the life of Olga, the hermits Sergius and Germanos lived upon the desolate island of Balam in Lake Ladoga, and that from thence Saint Abramius went to preach to the wild and barbarous inhabitants of Rostov. Olga, who ranks as a saint in the Russian calendar, and whom their chronicles compare to the sun, for as the sun illuminates the world, so she illuminated Russia with the faith of Christ, died 14 years after her conversion. In 967, at the advanced age of 85, she had been succeeded, on her abdication, by her son Sviatoslav, whom all her endeavors had failed to instruct in either the Christian religion or her own enlightened views of legislation and government. After her death, she was buried in a spot which she had herself chosen, by a Greek priest named Gregory, who had accompanied her from Constantinople, though her bones were afterwards removed by her great-grandson Yaroslav and interred in the Church of the Tithes at Kiev. And in fulfillment of her last request, none of the pagan games and other ceremonies called Tresny, usually performed in Russia over the graves of persons of distinction, were permitted to be celebrated over her tomb. It is uncertain at what period coined money was first generally used in Russia, but some pieces which were cast about this period are still preserved in Novgorod, bearing the impression of a man on horseback. The coin called grivia is mentioned for the first time in the Russian annals in 971, when, during a famine, a horse's head was sold for half a grivna, and the name appears to have been applied not only to the coin, which was worth a pound's weight of silver, but to the pound weight itself, and to the sum of 50 kuhns, the latter being a coin of stamped skin or leather, of which the current value was a marten's skin, the taxes being usually paid in furs. At this time, while the sovereigns principally resided at Kiev, Novgorod, their northern capital, was increasing and had again become an immense and important city. It was divided into 5 distinct towns, each of which was surrounded by a stone wall, defended by towers and ramparts, where a large body of archers and spearmen were continually mounted for its defense. The population amounted to about 500,000 of inhabitants. They have been joined within the last few years by a tram railway. Professor Retzius of Stockholm maintains that the Slavonians themselves do not belong to the Caucasian division of the human family. Dr. Latham considers that 9/10 of the modern Russians and inhabitants of Russia are of the Tartar race, or as he denominates it, the Ugrian, in which category he comprises the Huns, Finns, Kalmucks, and all the Tartar tribes in the empire except the Bashkirs. Article Tartar, Puny Cyclopedia. Dr. Karl Neumann, agreeing with Niebuhr, Bock, and Grote, considers that the Scythians were undoubtedly Tyrrhenians, or as he calls them, Mongolias. He supposes that coming from the depths of Asia they first settled among the Finns on the Ural, and he thus discovered in the traces remaining to us of their language much resemblance to that of the Mongolians. This was Decoding Finnish History, and we shall see next time. Respects.